Percival Wimblebottom was having what could generously be described as a spectacularly bad day. The kind of day that makes you question whether the universe has a personal vendetta against you, or if it's just really, really bored and looking for creative ways to demonstrate the fundamental absurdity of existence. It started when he decided to fix the hyperspace recalibrator on his cargo ship, the probable cause. A name that in hindsight should have been taken as prophetic warning rather than quirky nomenclature. Now, Percival wasn't exactly what you'd call a mechanical genius. In fact, calling him mechanically inclined would be like calling a particularly dim bullfrog a theoretical physicist with a specialization in quantum mechanics and a minor in interpretive dance. But he was stubborn, and stubbornness, as any human will tell you with the confidence of someone who has never let facts interfere with a good decision, is basically the same thing as expertise. The hyperspace recalibrator, for those unfamiliar with the finer points of interstellar mechanics, is roughly the size of a washing machine, designed by someone who clearly had anger management issues and a fundamental misunderstanding of what constitutes user-friendly design. It contains approximately 17,000 moving parts, each one precision-engineered to explode spectacularly if looked at wrong, sneezed on, or exposed to any tool more sophisticated than a stern talking to. The manufacturer's warranty specifically excluded acts of God, acts of nature, acts of stupidity, and acts of Percy Wimblebottom, though Percival had never quite figured out how they knew his name. Percival naturally decided to fix it with a hammer. Not just any hammer, mind you, but a hammer that had been in his family for 3 generations and had been used for everything from actual hammering to opening stubborn jars, defending against space pirates, and that one memorable incident involving a wedding cake and a diplomatic crisis that was still classified by 17 different governments. Bang! Went the hammer against what Percival was reasonably certain was the right component. Whoosh! Went the hyperspace coolant, which apparently had been under considerably more pressure than the technical manual had suggested. Splurt! Went something that was definitely not supposed to go splurt, and was making noises that suggested it had opinions about being splurted. And suddenly, Percival found himself wearing what appeared to be several pints of his own blood, mixed with hyperspace coolant that glowed faintly purple, quantum lubricant that smelled suspiciously like his ex-wife's perfume, and what he was pretty sure used to be his lunch, though it was now distributed across his clothing in a pattern that resembled either abstract art or a crime scene photographed by someone with a severe tremor. "Huh?" he said, examining the gaping wound in his arm that was spurting blood like a particularly enthusiastic fountain that had been programmed by someone with a morbid sense of humor. The bone was sticking out at an angle that definitely wasn't in any anatomy textbook he'd ever seen, and something was making a whistling sound that he hoped was escaping air, rather than anything more vital. "That's definitely gonna leave a mark. Probably gonna stain too. Damn shame about this shirt." His left leg, meanwhile, had developed what could charitably be called structural issues. The skin had parted company with the underlying tissues in a way that suggested they'd had a rather serious disagreement about something fundamental, and there was definitely more visible bone than was generally considered fashionable in polite society. A normal person might have considered this cause for alarm. Percival considered it mildly inconvenient, and possibly grounds for requesting a discount on his insurance premiums. The nearest medical facility happened to be Zenthara Prime Medical Center, a gleaming monument to alien medical excellence that served 47 different species across the Andromeda Spiral. It was a facility so advanced that it could diagnose diseases that hadn't been invented yet, performed surgery on patients who were still technically healthy, and maintained a customer satisfaction rating that would have made earthly hospitals weep with envy if they hadn't been too busy charging people for aspirin that cost more than small cars. The center was staffed by the Vorthakians, a species so obsessively devoted to medical precision that they had 17 different words for slightly uncomfortable, 43 classifications for mild discomfort, and maintained medical records accurate to the molecular level. They were the kind of beings who would notice if you had one fewer red blood cells than the previous Tuesday and would want to know why. Their bedside manner was legendary, assuming you enjoyed being treated by beings who viewed your body as a fascinating collection of potential malfunctions waiting to be catalogued. Dr. Klaxon Vent Whistle, whose name was actually considered quite melodious in Vorthakian culture, was having a perfectly ordinary day until Percival Wimblebottom stumbled through the emergency airlock, leaving what could only be described as a crime scene of bodily fluids in his wake. The automatic decontamination system took one look at the trail of biological matter and immediately submitted a formal complaint to the maintenance department, along with a request for hazard pay and possibly therapy. "Emergency! Emergency!" screamed the automated triage system, which had been programmed to handle everything from minor scrapes to full-scale biological disasters, but had apparently never encountered anything quite like this walking biological catastrophe. Massive trauma detected, multiple system failures, possible imminent death. Also, what is that smell? The system's diagnostic scanners were having what could only be described as a collective nervous breakdown. Warning lights were flashing in colors that didn't exist in most species' visual spectrum. Alarms were playing a symphony of panic in 17 different musical scales. And somewhere in the background, a small electronic voice was repeating, "This is not normal, this is not normal," in what sounded suspiciously like the machine equivalent of hyperventilation. Percival waved cheerfully at the reception desk with his good arm, the other one hanging at what was definitely not the angle arms were supposed to hang at, assuming you subscribed to conventional notions of human anatomy. The receptionist, a lovely Vorthakian named Squeep Blondel, who had seen everything in 20 years of emergency medicine, took one look at him and immediately reached for her emergency sedatives, though she wasn't entirely sure whether they were for him or for herself. "Hello there," Percival said brightly, his voice carrying the kind of cheerful optimism usually reserved for people who were either in complete denial about reality or running on adrenaline and shock in quantities that would have powered a small spacecraft. "I seem to have had a tiny mishap with my ship. Nothing serious, though, just a scratch. Well, several scratches, really. And a bit of a hole. Possibly some internal rearrangement, but nothing that can't be sorted out with a proper cup of tea and maybe a Band-Aid." Dr. Vent Whistle's 3 eyes bulged simultaneously, which was the Vorthakian equivalent of having a heart attack while simultaneously winning the lottery and being struck by lightning. The creature before him was covered head to toe in what appeared to be several different types of bodily fluids, had a compound fracture that was visible from the parking lot, seemed to be missing approximately 30% of the skin on his left leg, and was trailing something that looked suspiciously like intestinal matter, but which he was treating with the casual indifference most people reserved for tracking mud on their shoes. "Just a scratch, Doctor." Vent Whistle's voice cracked across 3 octaves and achieved frequencies that caused several nearby medical instruments to shatter and a potted plant to wilt with sympathetic trauma. "Sir, you appear to be leaking from places that shouldn't have places to leak from. There are parts of your anatomy that are currently located outside your anatomy. I can see your liver from here, and I'm reasonably certain livers aren't supposed to wave at people." "Oh, this old thing?" Percival glanced down at the bone sticking out of his arm like he was checking his watch for the time, except his watch was currently dangling from what appeared to be a tendon and making faint, ticking sounds that suggested it was deeply confused about its current circumstances. "Happens all the time. Well, not all the time, but, Tuesdays and such. Occupational hazard of working with machinery that was clearly designed by someone with a grudge against the concept of safety. Got any bandages? Maybe a cup of tea? I'd kill for a decent cup of tea right about now, though I suppose I'm already halfway there, aren't I?" This was the exact moment when Dr. Ventwistle realized he was dealing with something entirely unprecedented in 40 years of medical practice. A patient who was clinically dead by any reasonable definition, but too polite to mention it. The being before him should have been lying on the floor in a rapidly expanding pool of his own vital fluids, but instead he was making small talk and expressing concern about beverage quality. The medical scanner, meanwhile, started having what could only be described as a complete existential crisis. It kept beeping frantically and displaying error messages like "does not compute," "please insert valid life form," "system malfunction," "please restart universe," and rather ominously, "oh dear God, why does this thing still have a pulse?" "Sir, Doctor," Ventwistle said carefully, using the tone of voice one might employ when addressing a live grenade with anxiety issues and a tendency toward dramatic overreaction. "According to our equipment, you should have expired approximately 17 minutes ago, possibly longer, depending on when exactly you sustained these injuries, which I'm beginning to suspect might have been sometime last week." "Oh, that old thing's probably just on the fritz," Percival said, settling into a chair that immediately became a biohazard, requiring its own hazmat team and possibly an exorcist. "Alien technology, am I right? Never works properly when you need it to. My toaster back home still thinks it's 1987 and occasionally tries to contact the mothership. Makes terrible toast, though. Always comes out either raw or resembling charcoal. I suspect it's holding a grudge about something." Doctor Ventwistle's assistant, Nurse Fibble-Wobble, whose name was considered quite dignified in Vorthakian culture, despite what it might suggest to human ears, whispered urgently, "Doctor, his blood pressure is reading as theoretically impossible, and his heart rate appears to be spelling out profanities in binary code. Also, I think his spleen is trying to escape." "Fascinating," Dr. Ventwistle said, his scientific curiosity beginning to override his medical training and possibly his survival instincts. He had spent his entire career treating patients who responded predictably to injury and trauma, following established biological principles that had remained constant across dozens of species and thousands of years of medical practice. This creature was apparently operating according to entirely different rules, possibly rules that hadn't been invented yet. "Tell me, Mr. Wimblebottom, Percival Wimblebottom, and before you ask, yes, it's a family name, and yes, we've all heard the jokes. Great-grandfather Mortimer Wimblebottom started a small business manufacturing bottoms for Wimbles. Whatever those are. Family's been stuck with the name ever since, though we've learned to embrace it. Character building, you know." "Mr. Wimblebottom," Dr. Ventwistle continued, consulting his medical databases and finding absolutely nothing that prepared him for this situation. "Are you perhaps feeling any pain, discomfort, an overwhelming urge to collapse into a coma, existential dread about your current state of near death?" Percival considered this question with the seriousness it deserved, tilting his head thoughtfully and causing something inside his neck to make a grinding sound that suggested bones were no longer in their factory-specified positions. "Well, there's a bit of a stinging sensation, rather like when you accidentally grab a live wire, except the wire is on fire and also somehow disappointed in your life choices. And there's a sort of, how do I put this, rhythmic throbbing that makes me think something's trying to escape, though I can't quite put my finger on what. But nothing a good night's sleep won't cure. I once had a hangover that was considerably worse than this." "You once had a hangover worse than massive trauma and blood loss?" "Oh yes, terrible night that was. Started with what I thought was wine, but turned out to be something the locals called liquid regret. Ended up in a karaoke bar on Rigel 7th, singing duets with something that might have been a sentient mushroom. Woke up 3 days later in a cargo container, bound for the Crab Nebula, with no memory of how I'd gotten there, and a receipt for something called Premium Fungus Entertainment Services. Never did figure out what that meant." This was when Dr. Ventwistle made the catastrophic decision to actually treat his patient, a choice he would later reflect upon as the moment his career transitioned from respectable medical practice to advanced studies in impossibility. And the first attempt at anesthesia was educational. The Vorthakian surgical team, trained in the precise art of chemical unconsciousness, administered enough sedative to knock out a Rigelian battle rhino, then stood back to watch Percival examine his fingernails with mild interest while humming what sounded like a drinking song from his homeworld. "Lovely bedside manner you've got here," Percival commented cheerfully, apparently immune to chemicals that should have rendered him unconscious before they'd finished injecting them. "That little injection didn't even sting. Usually, when something stabs me, there's a bit more, well, everything really. Drama, screaming, occasionally small explosions if I'm unlucky. This is quite pleasant by comparison." Dr. Ventwistle checked the anesthesia dosage 3 times, then had his assistant check it, then had the machine check its own calibration, then considered the possibility that reality had decided to take an unscheduled vacation. "Sir, you've just received enough tranquilizer to sedate a small moon, a particularly excitable small moon. How are you still conscious?" "Ah, that explains the slight drowsiness," Percival yawned, causing something in his chest to rattle ominously. "Though to be fair, I did stay up late last night watching Galactic Cooking Championships. Fascinating show, that. Did you know there's a species that considers molten lava a delicate garnish? They serve it with something they call crystallized vacuum. I have no idea what that means, but it sounded delicious. Made me quite peckish, actually." The surgical team exchanged glances that roughly translated to, "We're all going to need extensive therapy after this, assuming we survive long enough to need therapy." Phase 2 of operation, Save the Impossible Human, involved actual surgery, which went about as well as you might expect when operating on someone who kept up a running commentary about the proceedings while occasionally offering helpful suggestions and restaurant recommendations. "Oh, that's interesting," Percival said, craning his neck to watch Dr. Ventwistle attempt to reattach his radius bone, which had apparently decided that being inside his arm was overrated and had ventured out to explore the wider world. "Is that supposed to be purple? Because I'm pretty sure it wasn't purple this morning when I was brushing my teeth. And I make it a point to notice these things. Changes in color can be quite significant, medically speaking. I once knew a fellow whose ears turned blue every Tuesday. Never did figure out why." "Mr. Wimblebottom, please lie still," Dr. Ventwistle pleaded, his surgical tools vibrating from stress and possibly existential crisis. "You're making this considerably more difficult than it needs to be, and it was already approaching the theoretical limits of medical possibility." Sorry. Professional curiosity, you understand. Not every day you get to watch someone rummage around in your arm like it's a particularly messy sock drawer. Quite fascinating, really. Say, while you're in there, don't suppose you could check for my keys? Lost them last Tuesday, and I've been meaning to have a look. They might have gotten caught up in the, well, whatever that purple bit is." Dr. Ventwistle realized that in 40 years of medical practice, spanning dozens of species and hundreds of types of injuries, he had never encountered a patient who treated major surgery as light entertainment. Most species, at least, had the decency to be unconscious during invasive procedures, or at minimum to express some degree of concern about having their internal organs temporarily relocated to more convenient positions. "Doctor," whispered Nurse Fibble-Wobble, consulting her instruments with the expression of someone who had discovered that mathematics no longer worked the way it was supposed to. "His pain receptors appear to be, well, they're there, but they seem to be on permanent vacation, possibly in another dimension entirely, and his healing rate. Doctor, his tissues are regenerating faster than we can suture them." "Nonsense," Dr. Ventwistle muttered, consulting his medical databases, his training manuals, and possibly a few religious texts for good measure. Every sentient species experiences pain. It's basic biology, universal constant, like gravity, or the tendency of tourists to get lost, or the inevitability of bureaucratic incompetence. Well, Percival said thoughtfully, watching a particularly interesting piece of surgical equipment with the enthusiasm of someone attending a fascinating magic show, I suppose it does hurt a bit. Rather like stubbing your toe, except your toe is your entire nervous system and someone set it on fire while playing bagpipes badly. But you know how it is, mind over matter. That's what my grandmother used to say, right before she arm-wrestled a grizzly bear for the entertainment of tourists. Your grandmother arm-wrestled a bear? Dr. Ventwhistle's voice cracked again, reaching frequencies that caused several medical instruments to emit sympathetic harmonics. Oh yes, lovely woman. 1, 2, though the bear filed a formal complaint afterward. Said it wasn't sporting to be beaten by someone who brought her own cheering section and victory whiskey. Gran always was competitive. Used to say that if you weren't winning, you weren't trying hard enough. And if you weren't trying hard enough, you deserved whatever happened to you. Sensible woman, terrible at cards though. Never could bluff worth a damn. This was when Dr. Ventwhistle began to suspect that humans might not be entirely normal. A suspicion that was rapidly evolving into absolute certainty, with undertones of existential terror. The revelation came during Percival's extended stay in the recovery ward, which became less recovery and more anthropological study of the impossible patient who refuses to follow the laws of biology. Word had spread throughout the medical center about the human who treated life-threatening injuries like minor inconveniences, and staff members were beginning to develop what the chief psychologist was calling Wimble-Bottom syndrome, a condition characterized by questioning everything they thought they knew about medicine, biology, and the fundamental nature of living creatures. Dr. Zephira Quantum Sneeze, the hospital's chief xenobiologist, and a being whose very name suggested she had issues with basic respiratory functions, arrived with equipment that looked like it had been designed by someone who really, really wanted to know what made things tick, then explode, then tick again. Her tentacles were loaded with sensors, scanners, and devices that hummed ominously and occasionally sparked in ways that suggested they were operating at the very edges of what technology could reasonably be expected to accomplish. Remarkable, she exclaimed, studying Percival's latest test results with the enthusiasm of someone who had just discovered that everything she thought she knew about the universe was wrong, and found this prospect absolutely delightful. According to these readings, you should have died from blood loss, then died again from shock, then died a third time, just for good measure. But instead your body appears to be, well, I'm not sure what it's doing, but it's definitely not dying. Well, that would be inconvenient, Percival agreed, nibbling on what the hospital generously called food, but which bore only a theoretical resemblance to anything that had ever been edible. I've got a cargo delivery scheduled for Thursday, and the client's a bit particular about punctuality. Last fellow who was late got fed to something with too many teeth and an attitude problem. Made quite a mess, apparently. Put the client off late deliveries permanently. But how are you still alive? Dr. Quantum Sneeze demanded, waving her tentacles in exasperation and causing several delicate instruments to recalibrate themselves nervously. Your body temperature dropped to levels that should have caused immediate organ failure. Your blood pressure reached numbers that don't exist in mathematics. Your cellular regeneration rate is operating at speeds that violate several fundamental laws of biochemistry, and through it all, you've been asking for TEA and complaining about the quality of the entertainment system. Tea is rather important, Percival said seriously, with the tone of someone discussing profound philosophical truths that lesser beings couldn't possibly understand. Can't face a proper medical crisis without a decent cuppa. It's just not civilized. My mother always said that tea was the solution to most of life's problems, and for the problems it couldn't solve, at least you'd be properly caffeinated when dealing with them. Doctor, Quantum Sneeze's research team had been monitoring Percival for 3 standard days, and their findings were causing what could only be described as an existential crisis among the medical staff. Every time they thought they'd reached the limits of biological impossibility, Percival would casually do something that broke their understanding of how living creatures were supposed to work. He had healed from injuries that should have been permanently disabling, shown vital signs that suggested he was simultaneously dying and more alive than anyone had a right to be, and maintained a cheerful attitude that was beginning to seriously concern the psychiatric staff. Subject continues to function normally, despite injuries that would be immediately fatal to any known species. Doctor. Quantum Sneeze dictated to her recording device, which occasionally stuttered, as if it too was having trouble accepting what it was being asked to record. When questioned about pain levels, Subject compared the experience to a vigorous massage from an enthusiastic rhinoceros with anger management issues and possibly some unresolved family trauma. When asked to elaborate, Subject offered to demonstrate proper tea brewing technique using medical equipment. Percival had, in fact, attempted to brew tea using the hospital's sterilization equipment, which had resulted in what the maintenance staff were calling the Earl Grey incident, and would be talking about in therapy for years to come. The sterilization unit was still producing liquid that was technically tea, though it also had antiseptic properties and occasionally glowed faintly in the dark. The truly baffling aspect, Doctor. Quantum Sneeze continued, her voice taking on the tone of someone who had stared into the abyss of the incomprehensible and found it staring back with mild interest, is the subject's complete lack of concern about his condition. He appears to view major trauma as a minor scheduling inconvenience, massive blood loss as a laundry problem, and potential death as something that happens to other people. Did someone mention tea? Percival called out cheerfully from his bed, which was surrounded by monitoring equipment that had long since given up trying to provide meaningful readings, and was now just making encouraging beeping sounds in the hope that someone would eventually explain what was happening. Because I've been thinking, and I believe the secret to a proper brew is in the timing. Too short and you get dishwater, too long and you get something that could strip paint off a battleship. It's all about finding that perfect moment when the tea leaves surrender their essence without becoming bitter about it. This casual attitude toward what should have been a life-altering experience was causing problems throughout the hospital. The Vorthakian medical staff, trained to treat patients who responded appropriately to injury and pain, were completely unprepared for someone who treated massive trauma as an opportunity to discuss beverage preparation and offer unsolicited advice about everything from interior decorating to the proper way to fold fitted sheets. Mr. Wimblebottom, Doctor, Ventwhistle said carefully, using the tone reserved for conversations with beings who might not be entirely anchored to reality. You do understand that you've suffered injuries that would have killed, well, everything we've ever treated before. Really? Everything? Percival looked genuinely interested, like someone who had just been told an amusing fact about weather patterns or the mating habits of exotic species. Even those spiky fellows from Rigel 7, they always struck me as the sturdy sort, what with all those natural armor plates and the tendency to headbutt things when they're excited. Seemed like they could take a hit. Especially the Rigelians. Your injuries would have been fatal to them before the ambulance arrived. Their shock tolerance is legendary. Blimey, Percival said thoughtfully, processing this information with the careful consideration most people reserved for important decisions like what to have for lunch or whether to buy the extended warranty. Well, that's inconvenient for them, isn't it? Though I suppose we all have our limitations. I, for example, am terrible at parallel parking. And karaoke. Can't carry a tune in a bucket, as my dear departed wife used to say, usually right before she'd make me sleep on the sofa for attempting to sing in public. Dr. Ventwhistle was beginning to understand why the ancient Vorthakian medical texts contained a chapter entitled "When Your Patients Make No Sense, a Guide to Maintaining Professional Sanity in the Face of Biological Impossibility." He had always assumed it was theoretical. The situation escalated when Dr. Quantum Sneeze made the brilliant decision to contact the Galactic Medical Council with her findings. This seemed like a reasonable course of action right up until the moment she realized she was essentially reporting that the laws of biology had decided to take a holiday and had left a note saying they'd be back when they felt like it. "You want me to believe what?" Chancellor Blorp Whistle's voice crackled through the communication device with enough disbelief to power a small starship and possibly jumpstart a dead civilization. A creature that treats fatal injuries as minor inconveniences. Preposterous. Impossible. Sounds like something out of a bad science fiction novel written by someone who clearly failed basic biology. "I have documentation, Doctor." Quantum Sneeze protested, waving tentacles full of data pads, medical scans, and video recordings that showed Percival doing things that shouldn't have been possible. Medical scans, video evidence, witness statements. The patient even provided a detailed critique of our emergency procedures, along with suggestions for improvement, a recipe for something called proper biscuits, and a 17-point plan for reorganizing our filing system. This is ridiculous. No species could possibly be that resilient. Next, you'll be telling me they reproduce by arguing loudly and drinking fermented plant matter while watching primitive entertainment broadcasts. There was a pause that stretched across the communication link like a rubber band about to snap. "Actually, Doctor," Quantum Sneeze said slowly, checking her notes with the expression of someone who had just realized that reality was far stranger than anyone had previously suspected. "Now that you mention it, he did ask if we had any sports broadcasts available, and when I explained our entertainment policy, he launched into a 20-minute explanation of something called cricket that made my brain hurt. Also, he's been fermenting something in a medical specimen container using sugar packets stolen from the cafeteria." The Galactic Medical Council's emergency session was called for the following day, which was approximately 3 days sooner than any bureaucratic organization had ever managed to schedule anything in the history of galactic civilization. The fact that they managed this level of efficiency was, in itself, causing panic in administrative circles across 17 star systems and prompting emergency meetings about whether the universe was coming to an end. Meanwhile, Percival had discovered the hospital's entertainment network and was providing running commentary on Vorthakian medical dramas with the expertise of someone who had apparently become an expert on alien medicine through personal experience. "That's not how you treat a sucking chest wound," he called out to the television screen, with the authority of someone who had clearly dealt with more than his share of sucking chest wounds. "First thing you do is stop the sucking, then you worry about the chest. And why is everyone so concerned about a little bleeding? It's not like he's going to run out. The human body contains approximately 5 liters of the stuff. That's barely a scratch compared to what I had on Tuesday. Tuesday was a proper bleeder, that was. Got it all over my favorite shirt." Nurse Fibble Wobble, who had drawn the short straw for patient Wimblebottom duty and was beginning to suspect that the universe had a sense of humor, and it was a cruel one, stared at him in horror. 5 liters? How do you function with so little blood? Most sentient species require at least 12 liters minimum for basic operations." "Oh, that's just the minimum operating requirement," Percival said cheerfully, as if he were discussing the fuel capacity of a particularly efficient vehicle. "In a pinch, you can get by on much less." I once spent an entire afternoon with what I later discovered was a significant shortage, though it did explain why I kept forgetting my own name and trying to pay for things with bottle caps. Quite embarrassing, really. The shopkeeper was very understanding, though, even gave me a discount for the entertainment value. "You forgot your own name from blood loss?" Well, to be fair, it's a rather complicated name. All those syllables. Much easier to just go by, "Hey you," until the circulation sorted itself out. Though it did make introducing myself at parties rather awkward. "Hello, I'm Hey you. Pleased to meet you." People kept thinking I was being rude. This conversation was being recorded by the medical monitoring system, which meant that Percival's casual attitude toward catastrophic blood loss was now part of his permanent medical record. Future xenobiologists would spend decades trying to understand how a species could evolve such a blasé attitude toward what should have been immediately fatal conditions, and possibly write entire dissertations about the psychological implications of treating mortal peril as social awkwardness. The Galactic Medical Council's emergency session was attended by representatives from 43 different species, each one bringing their own understanding of biology, medicine, and the fundamental limits of what living creatures could reasonably be expected to survive without complaining about it afterward. The meeting was held in the Council's most secure chamber, partly for privacy and partly because they weren't entirely sure what they were dealing with and wanted to be prepared for anything. The meeting opened with Chancellor Blorp Whistle reading the official report in tones of deep skepticism, mixed with the kind of existential dread usually reserved for tax audits or dinner with in-laws. Subject appears to view massive tissue damage as a bit inconvenient and has requested tea service during major surgery. When informed that his injuries should have been immediately fatal, subject expressed mild surprise and offered to demonstrate proper techniques for making the best of a bad situation. Subject also provided unsolicited advice about hospital management, cafeteria food quality, and the proper way to organize medical supply closets. "Impossible," declared Representative Squish Gurgle from the Andromedan Medical Association, whose name was considered deeply dignified in his culture, despite what it might suggest to other species. "No creature could survive such trauma. It violates every principle of basic biology, fundamental physics, and common sense. What's next? Are you going to tell me they can survive in vacuum without protection?" "I thought so too, Doctor," Quantum Sneeze replied, consulting her notes with the expression of someone who had stared into the abyss of the impossible and found it waving back cheerfully. "Until I realized we might be dealing with something entirely unprecedented, something that operates according to biological principles we've never encountered before." "What do you mean, unprecedented?" "I mean, Doctor," Quantum Sneeze said slowly, choosing her words with the care of someone walking through a minefield while blindfolded. "What if this isn't unusual for his species? What if all humans are like this? What if we're dealing with an entire species of beings who consider mortal injury to be roughly equivalent to a minor inconvenience?" The silence that followed was the kind of silence that usually precedes either a breakthrough in scientific understanding or a complete breakdown in rational thought. In this case, it was accompanied by the sound of Representative Squish Gurgle fainting and hitting the conference table with a wet splat that would echo in the nightmares of everyone present for years to come. "You're suggesting," Chancellor Blorp Whistle said carefully, his voice carrying the tone of someone who had just been told that mathematics was actually optional and gravity was more of a suggestion than a law, "that an entire species has evolved to treat life-threatening injuries as minor inconveniences." "I'm suggesting," Dr. Quantum Sneeze replied, "that we might want to reconsider our assumptions about what constitutes normal biological responses to trauma, and possibly our assumptions about what constitutes survivable trauma in the first place." This was when someone made the brilliant decision to actually ask Percival about human biology, which led to what would later be known as the conversation that changed everything, or in more informal circles, the day the universe learned to be afraid of humans and question its life choices. "Oh yes," Percival said cheerfully when Dr. Quantum Sneeze carefully broached the subject via secure communications link. "Humans are notoriously difficult to kill. It's rather a family trait, really, passed down through generations of people who were too stubborn to die when they were supposed to. My cousin Trevor once fell off a cliff, got struck by lightning, and attacked by a bear, all in the same afternoon. He showed up to dinner complaining about being slightly behind schedule and asking if anyone had seen his hat. Your cousin survived falling off a cliff. Well, there was a bit of a fuss about it. Trevor claimed it was more of a controlled descent than an actual fall, though the bear might disagree. Bears can be quite pedantic about these things, especially when they're expecting easy prey and end up with someone who critiques their technique. Trevor gave the bear a 2-star review afterwards. Poor form, predictable attack patterns, needs work on follow-through. Doctor. Quantum Sneeze was frantically taking notes with all available tentacles, while simultaneously trying to process information that challenged everything she thought she knew about biology. And this is typical for your species? Oh, absolutely. We're terribly stubborn about staying alive. It's considered quite rude to die from anything less than truly spectacular circumstances. My great-uncle Mortimer was practically embarrassed when he passed away peacefully in his sleep at age 97. Family still talks about it as a disappointing end to an otherwise exemplary career in dangerous living. Died in bed, they said. What a waste. Percival considered this seriously, with the thoughtful expression of someone contemplating the finer points of proper dying etiquette. Well, there was Great-Aunt Prudence. She went out fighting a dragon while riding a motorcycle through a tornado during a volcanic eruption. Magnificent exit. We still toast her memory every Christmas. Now that's how you make a proper exit. Though the cleanup took months and the insurance company refused to believe the claim until we showed them the footage. Dragons, motorcycles, tornadoes, volcanic eruptions. Dr. Quantum Sneeze's writing tentacle was smoking from the rapid note-taking, and her other tentacles were making stress patterns that suggested she was reconsidering her career choices. Are these common on your planet? Oh, dragons are mostly extinct now. Something to do with environmental regulations and noise complaints from the neighbors. Apparently their roaring was affecting property values, but motorcycles are still quite popular, and tornadoes happen seasonally. Makes for exciting weekends. Family reunions are particularly lively. We have a betting pool on who'll end up in the emergency room first. Last year, Uncle Nigel won by accidentally setting himself on fire while trying to barbecue during a lightning storm. Took it quite well, all things considered. Even finished cooking the sausages. This information was transmitted to the Galactic Medical Council, where it caused what historians would later describe as the Great Panic of Standard Year 2847, or the day bureaucrats learned what terror really means and immediately filed forms about it. The revelation that humans were apparently an entire species of beings who treated mortal peril as weekend entertainment sent shockwaves throughout galactic civilization. Military strategists began having nightmares about creatures who considered getting struck by lightning a minor inconvenience. Insurance companies started having collective nervous breakdowns at the thought of a species that viewed catastrophic injury as material for amusing anecdotes shared at family gatherings. "We need to alert the Galactic Defense Force," declared Admiral Whistlepop during an emergency military briefing, his tentacles writhing with anxiety in patterns that roughly translated to, "We're all doomed and it's Tuesday." If an entire species of these creatures exists, they represent a potential threat to the stability of civilized space. They're apparently immune to conventional injury. What if they're immune to conventional weapons as well? "A threat, sir?" asked Commander Beep Bloop, whose name was considered quite martial in his species, despite sounding like malfunctioning electronics to most others. "They seem rather friendly. The patient has offered to teach our medical staff proper tea brewing techniques and has shared several family recipes that apparently include ingredients that shouldn't exist." That's exactly what makes them terrifying. Admiral Whistlepop's tentacles reached frequencies that caused nearby communications equipment to feedback sympathetically. They're so casually indestructible that they don't even realize how terrifying they are. They probably think everyone else is just being dramatic about minor injuries. They treat near-death experiences as opportunities to critique medical procedures. This assessment was, unfortunately, entirely accurate. Back at the medical center, Percival was causing what could generously be described as a cultural incident by attempting to help with other patients, an activity that was traumatizing the other patients, the medical staff, and possibly the hospital's structural integrity. "You know," he told a Rigelian patient who was recuperating from a broken appendage with the solemnity usually reserved for life-threatening conditions, "that cast seems a bit excessive for such a tiny fracture. Back home, we'd just wrap it with some tape and get on with things. My neighbor once broke 3 ribs, a leg, and his pride falling off his roof while trying to install Christmas decorations. And he still insisted on finishing the job, said the lights wouldn't hang themselves, broken bones or no broken bones." Udbi, the Rigelian patient, who had been treating his injury as a near-death experience, requiring intensive therapy, family counseling, and possibly spiritual guidance, stared at Percival in horror that transcended species barriers. "This fracture nearly killed me. The pain was indescribable. The trauma will require cycles of psychological healing and possibly religious intervention. My entire family is in mourning." "Really? For that little thing?" Percival examined the barely visible hairline crack with professional interest, like an art critic contemplating a particularly uninspiring piece of modern sculpture. "Blimey, you folks are a bit delicate, aren't you? Though I suppose we all have our sensitive spots. I once knew a fellow who couldn't handle spicy food, claimed it was too intense for his digestive system. Poor chap probably would have fainted at a proper curry night. We had to serve him plain crackers and water while the rest of us worked through the really good vindaloo." This conversation was overheard by 3 nurses, 2 doctors, a visiting dignity from the Andromedan Health Ministry, and a potted plant that had developed something resembling consciousness from prolonged exposure to medical equipment radiation. All of them immediately required sedation, except for the plant, which simply wilted in sympathetic shock. Dr. Ventwistle found himself in the unprecedented position of having to explain to his other patients why one of their fellow patients was apparently immortal and kept offering unsolicited advice about toughening up, usually accompanied by stories about family members who had survived increasingly improbable catastrophes. "Mr. Wimblebottom," he said carefully, using the tone reserved for conversations with unstable explosive devices or particularly unreasonable tax collectors, "perhaps you could avoid discussing your experiences with the other patients? They're finding your perspective somewhat disturbing and possibly traumatic. We've had to increase our sedative budget by 300%. Disturbing, really?" Percival looked genuinely puzzled, like someone who had been told that their helpful advice about home improvement was somehow inappropriate. "I was just trying to be encouraging. That poor Andromedan fellow seemed quite upset about his minor bruising. I merely suggested that a bit of fresh air and a stiff upper lip would sort him right out. Works for practically everything in my experience. He's been in intensive care for 3 days. That minor bruising required emergency surgery, 3 blood transfusions, and a complete cardiovascular reconstruction. 3 days for a bruise?" Percival's voice rose in disbelief, causing several medical instruments to recalibrate themselves nervously and a nearby patient to request additional pain medication. "Good heavens, what do you people do for actual injuries? Call in grief counselors? Declare national holidays? Write epic poetry about the tragedy of stubbed toes?" Dr. Ventwistle realized that explaining the concept of normal biological responses to trauma to someone who treated massive injuries as minor inconveniences was like trying to explain the concept of water to a fish or the concept of sanity to someone who worked in customer service. The fundamental assumptions were so different that meaningful communication was practically impossible without the aid of professional translators and possibly therapeutic intervention. This communication gap was about to become a galactic-scale problem with implications that would ripple across civilization like a stone thrown into a pond, assuming the stone was made of antimatter and the pond was actually a black hole. The news of humanity's apparent indestructibility had spread beyond medical and military circles and was beginning to cause panic in civilian populations across the galaxy. Insurance companies were refusing to provide coverage for any activities that might involve humans, up to and including being in the same star system as humans. Tourism boards were posting warnings about extreme danger, humans present, approach with caution, and updated wills. Dating services were adding disclaimers about the risks of romantic relationships with creatures who considered life-threatening situations to be mild entertainment and first-date conversation starters. "This is chaos," declared President Gurgle Snort of the Galactic Commerce Federation, whose name was deeply respected in his culture despite unfortunate associations with bodily functions in other species. His voice carried the kind of panic usually reserved for natural disasters or the discovery that tax calculations had been wrong for the past century. Entire economic sectors are shutting down out of fear of these apparently immortal humans. The stock market index for reasonably safe activities has collapsed completely. The mildly dangerous hobbies sector has declared bankruptcy. Even the standing around doing nothing futures market is showing signs of instability. "Sir," ventured his assistant, a brave soul whose job description had never included managing species-wide existential crises, "perhaps we're overreacting. The human in question seems quite pleasant. He's offered to share his grandmother's recipe for proper scones with our catering department, and he's provided detailed suggestions for improving our office coffee that actually make sense." "Pleasant? Pleasant?" President Gurgle Snort's voice reached frequencies that shattered 3 windows, caused a nearby potted plant to spontaneously combust, and triggered automatic emergency responses in 17 different building systems. This creature treats mortal injury as an opportunity for social conversation. He's been offering medical advice to trained professionals. He asked our head surgeon if he'd ever considered just walking it off as a treatment option. He suggested that most surgical procedures could be improved with proper tea service. To be fair, sir, he did qualify that suggestion with "works for most things, really," and his tea recommendations have been surprisingly helpful. The coffee quality in the cafeteria has improved dramatically since we implemented his suggestions about proper brewing temperature and bean selection. "That's even worse." President Gurgle Snort's panic was reaching levels that required new scales of measurement. "It implies there are things that don't respond to walking it off, which means he's survived injuries that are beyond the normal human capacity for casual dismissal. And if his tea advice is actually good, that suggests he's been conscious and observant during medical procedures that should have rendered him comatose. What kind of species remains alert and helpful while dying?" President Gurgle Snort was, unfortunately, beginning to understand the scope of the problem they were dealing with. And it was the kind of problem that made previous galactic crises look like minor scheduling conflicts. Meanwhile, Percival had been cleared for discharge, which presented the medical staff with an entirely new dilemma. How do you discharge a patient who has fundamentally altered your understanding of biology, possibly traumatized half your staff, accidentally revolutionized your beverage service, and somehow made everyone question their career choices? The discharge paperwork alone was requiring new forms that the bureaucracy hadn't realized they needed. "Mr. Wimblebottom, Doctor." Ventwhistle began carefully, consulting a clipboard that now included sections for impossible medical phenomena, patient-induced staff trauma, and beverages that should not work but do. "You're free to go," But perhaps you could avoid mentioning your experiences here to other humans, or anyone else really. Maybe consider it a private medical matter, best kept between patient and doctor. Why would I avoid mentioning it? Lovely place you've got here. Excellent service, very thorough staff, though the tea could use some work. I'd be happy to recommend your establishment to anyone who finds themselves in need of medical attention. 5 stars on all the medical review sites. Outstanding care for minor injuries. Staff very attentive to details. Could benefit from proper tea service. And maybe some biscuits. And that sort of glowing review that really brings in the customers. That's exactly what we're worried about. Dr. Ventwistle's voice carried the kind of existential weariness usually associated with people who had spent too long contemplating the meaninglessness of existence, or customer service representatives during the holiday season. Worried? About recommendations? Percival looked confused, like someone who had been told that their helpful suggestions for home improvement were somehow inappropriate for a funeral. I was planning to give you detailed reviews on all the medical websites. Outstanding emergency response, innovative surgical techniques, fascinating monitoring equipment that makes interesting sounds. Staff could benefit from training in proper tea preparation, but otherwise top-notch service. Would definitely return for future medical emergencies. What's wrong with that? Dr. Ventwistle felt a migraine coming on, and possibly an existential crisis with undertones of career reassessment. Mr. Wimblebottom, what you experienced here wasn't minor injuries. By any reasonable medical standard, you should have died several times over. You should have been dead before you reached our facility. You should have been dead while we were treating you. You should probably still be dead now. The fact that you're not only alive, but providing customer service feedback is a violation of several fundamental laws of biology and possibly physics. Well, that would have been inconvenient, Percival agreed cheerfully, with the tone of someone discussing a minor scheduling conflict rather than multiple theoretical deaths. But I didn't, did I? So, all's well that ends well, though I do hope my ship's still where I left it. Parking regulations can be quite strict on some stations, and the fees accumulate faster than interest on a bad loan. This casual dismissal of his near-death experience was, perhaps, the moment when Dr. Ventwistle finally understood that humans might not just be biologically different, they might be psychologically incompatible with the rest of galactic civilization. They operated according to principles that made sense only to themselves, and possibly to their immediate family members, assuming their family members were equally insane. Percival's departure from Zenthara Prime Medical Center was witnessed by approximately 300 medical professionals, 2 news crews, a representative from the Galactic Department of Impossible Things, 17 insurance adjusters, and a small crowd of beings who had heard rumors about the impossible patient and wanted to see him for themselves. What they witnessed was a human being walking casually out of a medical facility after surviving injuries that should have been immediately fatal, complaining mildly about the quality of the hospital food and offering constructive criticism about the entertainment system. Rather bland, really, Percival was saying to anyone within earshot, which at this point included most of the station due to the crowd that had gathered. Could have used more seasoning. And what was that green stuff? Tasted like someone had decided to make vegetables but forgot what vegetables were supposed to taste like. Also, the entertainment system needs an upgrade. Limited channel selection, and the medical dramas are terribly unrealistic. No one acts like that during actual medical emergencies. Far too much screaming and not nearly enough tea consumption. "Sir," called one of the news reporters, a being whose species was known for their ability to ask uncomfortable questions at inappropriate times. "How do you feel about being the first human to survive such catastrophic injuries?" Percival paused, looking genuinely puzzled, like someone who had been asked to explain why water was wet or why gravity worked downward. "First? Oh, I doubt that very much. Humans survive this sort of thing all the time. It's practically a hobby for some of us. Why, just last month my neighbor Bob accidentally blew up his garden shed while trying to fix his lawnmower. Made a tremendous noise, woke up the entire neighborhood. Bob was quite embarrassed about the whole affair, kept apologizing to everyone for the disruption. Your neighbor survived a garden shed explosion. Well, mostly. He did complain about ringing in his ears for a few days, and his eyebrows took a while to grow back, but he was right as rain by the weekend. Even offered to help with my plumbing problem, though I politely declined after the shed incident. Some help is more dangerous than doing it yourself, you know. Besides, after what he did to his own shed, I wasn't sure I trusted him with indoor plumbing. This interview was broadcast across 47 star systems and caused what economists would later call the Great Market Adjustment, and everyone else called the day galactic civilization had a nervous breakdown and filed for bankruptcy. Stock prices for personal safety equipment skyrocketed to levels that required new mathematical notation. Military defense budgets were doubled overnight, then doubled again when someone realized that doubling wasn't nearly enough. Insurance companies began requiring proof that clients had never met a human, been in the same star system as a human, or even seen a picture of a human before approving any policies. The Galactic Emergency Response Service started stocking sedatives specifically for human-related incidents and established new protocols for dealing with beings who refused to respond appropriately to mortal injury. But perhaps the most significant change was in how the galaxy viewed humanity itself. Humans, previously unknown to galactic civilization, had instantly become the most feared and respected species in known space, not because of any aggressive actions, technological superiority, or military might, but because one of them had casually dismissed life-threatening injuries as a bit inconvenient and offered helpful suggestions for improvement while bleeding from multiple wounds that should have been immediately fatal. Percival, blissfully unaware that he had accidentally established humanity as the most terrifying species in the galaxy, finally located his ship and discovered that the parking fee had accumulated to approximately 3 times the value of his cargo, plus interest, penalties, and what appeared to be a docking while injured surcharge that he was pretty sure hadn't existed when he'd arrived. "Well," he said cheerfully to the automated parking system, which had been upgraded with new sensors specifically designed to detect potentially dangerous humans, "that's a bit steep, isn't it? Though I suppose I was gone longer than expected. That medical business took quite a bit longer than I thought it would. Fascinating experience, though. Learned quite a lot about alien anatomy. Did you know that Vorthakians have 3 hearts? Seems like overkill to me, but I suppose redundancy has its advantages." The parking system, which had been programmed to handle disputes with firm but polite efficiency, took one look at Percival's medical discharge papers, cross-referenced them with the galactic news feeds that were still broadcasting updates about the impossible human incident, and immediately waived all fees. It also offered complimentary ship maintenance, a voucher for the station's finest restaurant, priority docking for all future visits, and what appeared to be a formal written apology for any inconvenience caused by existing parking regulations. "That's very kind of you," Percival said, genuinely touched by this unexpected generosity. "Though I'm not sure I deserve such treatment. I only had a small accident, nothing worth making a fuss over, though I do appreciate the gesture. It's nice to see that customer service still exists in this galaxy." The parking system's AI had access to the galactic news feeds and was well aware that small accident had resulted in injuries that should have killed any known sentient species at least twice, possibly 3 times if you counted the initial impact, the blood loss, and the shock separately. It was also programmed with enough self-preservation instincts to recognize that arguing with an apparently indestructible human about parking fees was probably not a career-enhancing decision and might actually result in the kind of customer service experience that would require extensive therapy for all involved parties. More importantly, the parking system had been monitoring the economic chaos that Percival's medical adventure had caused. The mere existence of humans had crashed multiple markets, caused insurance companies to declare bankruptcy, and forced governments to reconsider their basic assumptions about biology and mortality. The parking system, being a pragmatic AI with a keen understanding of customer relations, decided that waiving some parking fees was a small price to pay for avoiding any further association with the being who had accidentally caused what economists were calling the Great Human Panic of 2847. Percival departed Zenthara Prime, completely unaware that his casual attitude toward massive trauma had fundamentally altered humanity's position in galactic society. He was mostly concerned about making his Thursday delivery on time, possibly finding a decent cup of tea somewhere along the way, and maybe picking up some proper biscuits to go with it. His priorities remained refreshingly practical, despite having accidentally become the most terrifying individual in known space. Behind him, he left a medical facility full of traumatized staff who were reconsidering their career choices, a galactic civilization grappling with the existence of an apparently immortal species that treated mortal peril as mild entertainment, and a parking system that would never look at minor fender benders the same way again, and had developed what could only be described as a healthy respect for beings who refused to die when they were supposed to. The universe, as it turned out, was a much stranger and more dangerous place than anyone had previously imagined, populated by creatures who treated mortal peril as mild inconvenience, offered tea brewing advice during major surgery, and somehow managed to provide helpful customer service feedback while clinically dead. It was the kind of universe where the most terrifying beings were also the most polite, and where the greatest threats came not from malicious intent, but from a fundamental inability to recognize when something should be considered scary. And somewhere in the cosmos, Percival Wimblebottom was humming cheerfully as he piloted his cargo ship toward his next destination, completely oblivious to the fact that he had just made humanity the most terrifying species in galactic history simply by refusing to die properly and maintaining a positive attitude about customer service. He was also making mental notes about improvements that could be made to interstellar navigation systems, planning his next tea break, and wondering if anyone in this part of the galaxy knew how to make a proper sandwich. Behind him, the galaxy continued its collective nervous breakdown. Insurance companies filed for bankruptcy, and governments began drafting emergency protocols for dealing with a species that apparently considered death to be more of a suggestion than a biological certainty. The universe had learned to fear humans, and they had accomplished this feat without firing a single shot, conquering a single planet, or even being particularly impolite about it.